Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with you. As Tom mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Western Connecticut Council of Governments, which is one of 9 regional councils of government serving 18 municipalities in Western Connecticut, including New Canaan. We are the next best thing to county government in Connecticut, which we haven't had since 1960. We are a forum for intermunicipal cooperation and a resource for communities like yours. And Kevin, Jamie, and others come to us for help in addressing challenges that we all face in this region. Tonight I'll talk about 830G. It's technically known as the Affordable Housing Appeals process, and it emerged from the Blue Ribbon Housing Commission in 1989. That was a comprehensive legislative commission that looked at the challenges surrounding housing affordability in Connecticut and released a number of recommendations. Interestingly, 830G was not one of its recommendations. It emerged seemingly out of the ether and became law. It's modeled on a Massachusetts law called 40B. 830G is a market-driven approach to affordable housing. And essentially, it's an escape valve for developers. The thinking in the 1980s was that zoning can increase the cost of housing, and we know it literally can increase the cost of housing. If you were to say the minimum lot size is 100 acres, that makes it very hard to buy a parcel. Now, there are other reasons to have minimum lot sizes, but zoning is one factor that can increase the cost of housing, as can lumber, materials, labor, lending, building codes, health codes, fire codes, safety codes, and many, many other factors. It's one of the many factors that can affect the cost of housing. The legislature in its wisdom passed 830G, and essentially what it does is it allows developers to go to court and have a court require that a local zoning commission set aside whatever you have on the books and approve the development. And a developer can go to court if a couple of conditions are met. The primary condition is that a municipality has under 10% of its housing stock, all the housing units in town, deemed affordable. And a number of different types of units count as affordable. It's a metric that might not make sense to you as a homeowner or a renter, but it's in statute. That metric includes housing for which a tenant receives a subsidy, such as a Section 8 voucher. Of course, there are never enough of those. It includes public housing authority, so housing that is publicly owned. It includes housing for which a rehabilitation loan has been provided, which some communities do. I'm not sure if New Canaan does that. And it also includes what we most often focus on, which is housing for which a restriction has been put on the deed that is filed with the town clerk in your vault. And that deed restriction says that that home may not be sold for a price or rented for a price that would be more than 30% of either 60% or 80% of the lower of state median income or area median income. So it is somewhat complex, it is a numbers game, but the goal was to ensure a diversity of housing stock. So if a developer has a project, about 120, 130 municipalities in Connecticut are subject to this appeals process because they don't hit this 10% threshold. In municipalities like Stanford, which has a 10% threshold, this option of going to court to override local zoning is foreclosed. But in, say, New Canaan, Darien, and many, many other communities. These include communities such as Scotland, Connecticut, where for 6 or 7 years, not a single building permit was filed. It's not just a factor of wealth. There are communities in the state that are not wealthy that don't meet the 10% because nobody's building housing there. But if you don't meet that 10%, a developer can come in essentially and say, it's my way or the highway. And so what we've seen over the years is, in some cases, developers have a desire to diversify the housing stock in the municipality and provide a lower price, more affordable product. In many other cases, developers can use 830G as a bargaining chip or as a leverage because they know that if they're going to set aside 30% of the units in the development as affordable, that comes to the cost of their bottom line. And so, for instance, where I live, a developer came in and said, if you don't give me what I want, I will put in hundreds of low-income Section 8 housing units and I'll bust people in from other towns. It was actually a really horrible thing he said. because he was treating human beings as bargaining chips. He didn't actually care about their welfare. He was using it to try to build luxury housing developments. It said, if you don't let me build the luxury housing developments that you don't currently allow for, I'm going to build housing for the poor. And the implication was that we don't want that, and that's not true. So 830G has been amended a number of times. There's been a constant to and fro, a struggle over 830G, because municipalities, no matter how well-meaning, often cannot get to that 10%. Municipalities rarely build housing. Municipalities do not control the cost of lumber or labor. They do not control lending. Housing is built by the private sector, by and large in this country, and yet municipalities are held to account for what the private sector is or is not doing. So, given this, over the last 30 years we've had 830G, there have been a number of amendments, and one of the primary amendments was to create a so-called moratorium process. So the original problem with 830G, aside from the fact that this 10% is this very fixed number, it's all or nothing, was that municipalities do not get credit for taking steps to addressing the challenge, right? So nobody's going to zoom from 0% affordable or 2% affordable to 12% in 1 year. That doesn't happen, especially in a state like Connecticut, where we have lagged the nation in job creation, and jobs are what drives housing. Where there is job creation, you see housing at all levels being built. And also a state where population is not growing. Developers do not build homes that will sit vacant. In a healthy real estate market, single-digit percentages of units are vacant. We don't have a lot of spec homes, and for good reason. So, getting back to what I was saying, over the course of the last 30 years, there have been numerous modifications, and one of them was to create a moratorium process. And essentially it says, if you build a certain quantum of houses, which is 75 housing equivalent unit points, or in some cases 50, or 2%, larger of those two, I want all your housing stock municipality. I'm not going to bore you with the numbers. I have my cheat sheet right here because even I can't remember this. If you build a certain number of housing units over a 4 or 5 year period, you can obtain a moratorium, and over a 4 or 5 year period, that will shield you from use of the affordable housing appeals process. And so many municipalities, including New Canaan, have worked some more, some less diligently, and of course they do what they can, because if the financing falls apart, the housing doesn't get built. If a developer pulls out, it doesn't get built. If labor is unavailable or material spike in cost, doesn't get built. And so essentially, they've been working to obtain a moratorium. Moratoriums tend to be easier in smaller towns. Greenwich is in Westcott. Greenwich is a lot larger than New Canaan, approximately 60,000 people. And feasibly, they can't obtain a moratorium. It would require 2% of their housing stock. Their housing stock is, I believe, around 24,000 units. 2% of that is far too much to be built, especially when the municipality is largely built out. When a developer does go to the affordable housing appeals process, there are a couple cases where the zoning is not set aside. And it doesn't apply to just zoning. It set aside all local regulation with respect to development. If it's related to health, safety, or some overriding public concern, a matter of public policy, that cannot be addressed any other way, that development cannot be redesigned to avoid that impact, then a municipality can succeed in the appeals process. But the burden of proof is on the municipality, and we don't have comprehensive data on it, but anecdotally 75 to 80% of appeals are ruled in favor of the developer. And they tend to be, it's a very adversarial process, a very litigious and expensive process. This is not a process that brings municipalities and the private sector together in pursuit of a shared goal. It's really one that sets us up for lawsuits and fights, unfortunately. So that is where we stand today on 830G. You may have seen over the last couple of years, there has been a lot of discussion in the General Assembly and in the public about other, and I'm not going to talk about those right now, but other approaches to affordable housing. Some overlay 830G, some might replace 830G, but they all come at it from different angles. Today we're talking about 830G, and I understand in Canaan we have some real challenges with it, especially regarding the moratorium. And we at Westcott do have some proposals to perhaps improve 830G that stakeholders from all sides could support. But again, what I've often heard is that this is really a third rail of politics in Connecticut. And even trying to get common sense fixes to it, it's practically impossible. It's not to say it is impossible, but it's really hard to do. So that's a quick history of 830G. And if there are no other questions, I can pass them on to my colleague.
Yes, if you would, thank you very much, Francis. And just so you know, in 2017, when that moratorium capped with 20,000 dwelling units, so basically it's applicable for municipalities with 20,000 or more dwelling units. New Canaan only has 7,500. Of course, there were a number of us that proposed reducing it to 5,000 or even less, and we were unsuccessful. So I would encourage all of you, when you're speaking to your candidates, what are their proposed thresholds for or proposed revisions to 830G, and if they would agree to support 5,000 or less, and lower the percentage of 10%. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Next, we got Scott Hobbs to talk about New Canaan's current status and where we are.
Sure. So I came in the affordable housing world because, as frequently happens, somebody said, "Oh, we just need a little bit of help. You don't have to do anything." And 15 years later, I was taking the chairmanship, and everything still on. But I found it to be a very interesting proposition. I worked with Chuck Berman, who some of you may know, who used to run Avalon Properties, and just a real genius developer that really helped to get our program started. Nothing had happened forever. We had Millport, which, for those of you who know, it just deteriorated into a horrible place down on Millport Avenue in New Canaan. And through Chuck's vision, we were able to convert the 40 units that were down there to 113 new units. And then we worked with New Canaan Neighborhoods, which Chris Hussey was the founding member of, that helped to go ahead and create Canaan Parish, which is a Section 8 development up on 123. And we managed to fully refurbish those units, and those 60 original units, plus we have another 40 units that are going to be coming online within probably about 2 months or so. So overall, we'll created around 225 new units. And the old units were there, but they were not good units. And in addition to not necessarily being good units, they were affordable housing under area median income, which is roughly $181,000 today. So when you take affordable housing based upon 80, 60, or 40% of either area median income or state median income. So obviously 181 is a pretty high number for the area income. State income as a reference point is $112,000. As you sit there and look and go, okay, well, state is a lot less. Under definitions of affordable housing today, basically everything has gone off of the state median income. So the old units under area median income, they didn't even really count toward affordable housing. But right now, we're actually having problems in trying to go ahead and not be penalized for rejuvenating our old units. And I think one of the biggest problems that I personally have on the 830G rules is that, first off, it has one set of rules for every town inside of Connecticut. So Scotland, New Canaan, Greenwich, and Bridgeport all have the same 830G requirements. Now, of course, Bridgeport maxes out. There's a couple of little nuances. This is the number of units. But what are the odds that the solutions for each of those type of communities are the same? The answer is 0. It's absolutely impossible. And yet here we are tied to the same rules. In addition, as they set up the incentive program to go ahead and have us to reach a moratorium, we'll go ahead and if you show progress, we're going to reward you and give you a little break on the strap. But then they make reaching that moratorium really hard. It took us months in order to find someone to even go ahead and do the application process. We called like every legal firm in the entire state. Nobody wanted to do it, which makes sense because I think there's only been like 10 applications. In the history of the law in the last 40 years, 10 communities have managed to get there. So no one wants this as their business model. We call architects, we call everyone. And I think the application we ended up filing was something like 171 pages. And there's all sorts of minutiae in it, and the laws are not quite clear, and it's unsure what you're supposed to do. And meanwhile, the end result is that we've really tried to do something good for our community, for the people in it. We're trying to address the issues. And the answer is like, yeah, but not good enough. We don't care. We're still going to go ahead and subject you to the possible punishments of 830G. And the punishments are, again, huge. And we've started to, there's places to stay, if they're neutral, there's places where 830G applications get filed by developers. And it can literally mean that 1 foot off your property line, you get a 7-story building. And I don't care who you are, that's not right. I mean, that's just not fair inside of the realm of things. And in addition, they're actually now, essentially they're encouraging housing authorities to become the developer. So for us to reach our rolling moratoriums, well, first off, if we wanted to actually get to a permanent moratorium, we need to create about 500 more units. For a frame of reference, the View, Millport, the Millport Housing Development, and Canaan Parish are all around 100 units. So we got to put 5 more of those somewhere inside of New Canaan. And we got to average about one of those every 4 years for the next 5 years. That land doesn't exist naturally inside of New Canaan. So that means that either a developer comes in and does it at 30%, and if they do it at 30%, then I think that means we need to get like 2,000 units before we're protected, or the housing authority can go in and do it. And that means that we as the town have to go ahead and tell our neighbors, sorry, you lost. For the good of the town and housing stuff, we're gonna go ahead and put that 7-story building right next to your property. Thank you very much. And I mean, that's not fair. And I don't care who, I challenge any housing authority advocate to say that they would not protest if this happened next door to them. I don't think that would end up happening. So in the meantime, you also have to figure out the finances. There's no magical source of money. I mean, the state claims to have a magical source sometimes, but really we don't borrow in that money. It has to get paid back someday. But for an affordable unit, a single bedroom unit may generate somewhere around $12,000 a year in income. And that's pretty generous. You gotta pay real estate taxes and depreciation, you gotta run the development, you gotta do everything else. It costs around $450,000 to build a unit. So that $12,000 at 5% supports around $250,000 worth of debt service. So somebody has to pony up the $200,000 of additional funding in order to build the other units. And the state does not provide anything close to that, and especially not for suburban communities. I mean, most of the money ends up going toward more high density and city units. So it really is a huge burden on local communities to have this thrust upon us. And for New Canaan, we've tried to deal with this by imposing a surtax or a fee on top of all building permits of 1%. And that does provide seed money, and the seed money allows us to help advance process. And if we get the land, we can almost kind of make the deal work out, almost, but it's really nip and tuck, and it is not a good business. If we don't have the land, then we need to have somebody buy the land and give it to us, and then the numbers come roughly in the right neighborhood. But it is really a big burden on top of communities, and essentially the winner of this ends up being developers who get to come in and really overdevelop an area, really outside of the control and the sanity of the local people. I will say the only thing that in helping out in this process, I've referred to like 830G being a bazooka. And you can solve problems with a bazooka, but it makes a really big mess. And it is nice that one thing 830G has helped a little bit on is that some people, some zoning commissions have gone ahead and become a little bit more forward thinking. Some things like auxiliary housing units and trying to figure out different ways around the problem. However, under 830G, again, you don't get credit for that. So if Penny were to go ahead and rent out the apartment above her garage, which I don't think you have, but so you had one and you wanted to rent it out, the fact that you're renting it for $900 a month doesn't count toward our affordable housing loans unless you deed it for 40 years?
40 years.
For 40 years to be affordable and subject yourself to all of the deals about not only being a landlord, but being a landlord under affordable housing. And being a landlord under affordable housing has more restrictions. So here's a great idea that can actually create a bunch of naturally occurring affordable housing, but you get zero credit for that because you don't tie it over to the state. It doesn't fall under the rules. It would be much nicer if everyone could try to work together and figure out ways to actually increase under a market base versus being forced down to the zone rules. It's probably not true.
We still have a minute or two. If you could, before we get to Bob and Laura, I've got a list of proposed legislative initiatives that we've done, but I'd rather hear from you both on some of your ideas, particularly Francis, you were talking about in more detail some of the proposals that you, Westcott, had suggested. You want to get into a little bit of that? You've got a couple minutes before we get to Bob and Laura.
Sure, thanks, Tom. As I said before, 830G probably isn't going to go anywhere, and if you were to replace it, what you might get could be worse. So we'll just leave it at that. So trying to make it work better, there are a couple of concepts. One of the issues we keep seeing is the difference between area median income and state median income. And for a project to pencil out, if you're building the state median income, that's going to be very hard. Also because the cost of construction is so much higher in this real estate market in the New York metro area than it is in eastern Connecticut. So one concept is to allow municipality to, for projects that are developed in concert with the developer, not the appeals process, not where they go to court and say we want to override zoning, but one where they work through inclusionary zoning, that the municipality could use area median income and that would count towards 830G. So the municipality has an incentive to work with the developer to avoid litigation, and the developer has an incentive to work with the municipality because they can essentially make the figures work out better. So that's one option. We've also heard a lot about transit-oriented development. We know that the number 2 cost for households after housing is transportation, and for low to moderate income households, that's about 20% of their household budgets. And so we talk a lot about 80% affordable housing and 60% affordable housing. Well, here's the reality. If you have 100%, so median income price house, and you don't need a car, it's 80% rather than 100%. So the thinking is, let's support transit-oriented development, not by forcing on anybody, but saying, hey, if these units are being built close to train stations, obviously with local control, or close to bus rapid transit, then maybe you get extra housing equivalent unit points and work towards a moratorium. And that gives municipalities an incentive to work with developers and locate housing where people don't need cars or be causing traffic, and also get to your moratorium a little bit more expeditiously. The other concept we've seen, there are a lot of different ways to I don't want to offend cat owners here, but skin this cat. Other states have taken some other approaches. Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Washington State do something interesting. So if you own a farm in Connecticut or a large forest tract, we tax you to really low rates because we want you not to sell out and develop that, because you are providing local food for us, and you're providing habitat for us, you're providing clean water and clean air, and we want to keep that property undeveloped. You're providing a social benefit in exchange for sacrificing some private gain, because you could probably make more money selling your farm out. We don't do that for affordable housing. Affordable housing does provide housing for all of the workers we need in our communities. You're providing a social benefit, but a landlord who charges less than market rent doesn't get anything in return. They still end up paying the exact same property tax if they were to charge market rent. So there may be some options on a voluntary basis for municipalities to look at some tweaks to the tax code. The plus side of adjusting assessments to reflect lower than market rent is that it allows a landlord to pass that cost of that savings on to a renter and reduce the rent. So there are a lot of concepts out there. Those are a couple we floated. I think what's key to all these concepts is if you want to make some changes, they have to be voluntary, absolutely voluntary. And second, they have to have something for everybody. So there has to be something that appeals to housing advocates, or so-called housing advocates. There has to be something that actually serves low to moderate income people. And they also have to protect local control and make sure that our communities are designed the way they need to be.
Thank you. Scott, we'll come back to you. First, I want to have Bob say a few words about his position on 830G and some potential revisions to it. Bob.
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody. I'll start by saying I am not an 830G expert. I've been studying fastidiously on it, but I'll tell you a couple things to me that this is not about. Number one, I think it's not a partisan issue. I think it's great that we've got people from the other side of the aisle here. And this is absolutely not against providing more affordable housing for the people of Connecticut. I grew up in New Haven on Dixwell Avenue, and my dad was a clerk at the Southern England Telephone Company for about 30 years. And I can still remember the day when my dad, in 1970, we were in a 3-family house on Pond Street. We lived on the bottom floor. My grandparents lived on the middle floor. And there were a bunch of crazy Southern Connecticut State College students on the top floor. I can still hear the parties that were going on there. And I can tell you when my dad came to me and said, we're moving away from your friends, we're moving away from your grandparents, and you're going to go to a new school, I was not happy. And he grew up in New Haven. He went to Hill House. And Hill House was under deterioration right then. He said, Rob, called me Robbie, he said, we need better schools. So we moved to North Haven. Not that that was a massive step up, but he bought a house for $25,000. It was a 2-bedroom house for my 3 sisters and me. And this is not a sob story. Trust me, I do a lot of that in political. This is the truth. My bedroom was a walk-in closet. And as I grew, I had to start to curl up my feet because it wasn't 6 feet long. But he paid $25,000 for it. He had a $20,000 mortgage, and he paid it off over 30 years. Every single month he made that mortgage payment. So I am acutely aware, and I suspect if we were in Bridgeport, it would be a different discussion than we're having here right now. We talked about here, rightfully so, the impact on your community. There's another side to this, and I am not insensitive to that. And I think we need to support that side, but I think 830G is a fundamentally bad bill. It's 40 years old. It was put in right around the day that the Berlin Wall came down. You've got 138 of 169 towns that do not comply with it. It's a one-size-fits-all approach, which in the state of Connecticut, you could not have more diversities in your towns. So to have a one-size-fits-all approach, I don't think is appropriate. We're using the stick rather than the carrot. Right now, the threats coming out of Hartford is that if you don't comply with 830G, you're going to start to lose funding, transportation funding. I don't think that's appropriate. Some of the metrics seem flawed to me. The fact that housing units put into place before a certain year don't count, or that senior citizen affordable housing, you get half a credit per person. So Laura and I have the debate, right? Laura, I think, believes it can be fixed. My initial reaction is get rid of it and start over. We're still going to debate that. I assume we'll have an answer by the time we assume the role. But the issue right now is it's not working. You hear too many stories of developers going to the town hall and saying, here's what I want to build, a luxury. If you don't agree with it, I'll just go call it affordable housing, we'll get it done without you. The kind of threat. And I assume there's some developers out there that are doing the right thing and trying to build the right kind of housing. I assume that's happening as well. But when you have something that for most people is your largest single investment, I just think there's an equity issue here. And although Kevin Moynihan has done a great job of taxes and cost of living and everything else, it's expensive to live in Connecticut. And when you're putting that kind of money into your single investment, I think you've got the ability to be able to protect that value. And I don't think it should be ripped away from you. Particularly if your own zoning committee has no ability to have any say in it. So then there's the hard part. What is the answer? And I'll be honest, I don't know the answer, but I don't think it's 830G. I do think it needs to be a more collaborative approach. I think it needs to be a carrot, not a stick approach, which maybe for the right type of development, there's a subsidy, or maybe there's tax relief, or maybe there's something, some incentive to do the right thing. I don't think holding a 10% threshold over everybody in Connecticut and saying you will comply, otherwise we're going to start cutting your funding, I don't think that's the right approach. It's not the way to handle something like this. So again, I would repeal it, start over. We certainly need more local input on this. I think sometimes in Connecticut, we always start at the top down and we don't talk to the people who are impacted enough. And we need to understand that I don't think it's the same solution by every community. I think we need to work with the communities. But this is not code word for get rid of affordable housing. I'm a product of affordable housing. It's important. The issue is we're not doing it the right way. In my opinion, we need to have some courage. We need to stand up. We need to say this bill needs to go away in one form or the other. And we need to find a better solution to this problem on a bipartisan basis, working with the communities. Too many times in Connecticut, we stick our head in the sand and we say, well, we'll just leave it there. You know what? It's been there for 40 years. If it has even begun to work, we wouldn't have 138 cities and towns and cities that are out of compliance, and we wouldn't have the affordable housing issue we have in Connecticut right now. So let's have the nerve, let's have the guts to stand up and admit it, get input from the local communities, preserve the value that people in this town have put in their houses, but also find a way for people who want to leave the cities. They shouldn't have to either. That's the other thing. We kind of jump to, well, there's not enough affordable housing in the city, so let's move everybody to the suburbs. That should be an opportunity, right? People should have the opportunity to do that, but there should also be the opportunity to stay where you are. Because I can tell you, I didn't want to move in 1970. I don't think my mom wanted to move, but we were forced to move because there was no other alternative. So let's find the right balance. Let's work on this on a bipartisan basis, and let's preserve the uniqueness of the communities. We were in downtown New Canaan, sitting there for a couple hours. It's a beautiful town. More people should be able to enjoy it, but we shouldn't be taking that uniqueness away. There's other ways to solve this problem. So with
Laura?
I don't know what else is left to say. No, really, that I really appreciate. We don't talk about this in depth a lot, so I really appreciated hearing what Bob had to say. I've served in the legislature for 8 years, and 2015 was the first year I submitted legislation to try to amend 830G, and each year I have. This past year, I put in 4 bills, none of which were going to be raised by the Housing Committee. The chair is a friend of mine, and I'm like, look, you're not raising one of my lousy bills. Can you do something? He's like, we'll have a public hearing on 830G overall. And, what you've heard from Francis and what you've heard from Scott and Bob, you just outlined things so eloquently. Living in the town of Fairfield, what I can tell you from my experience is our town was very progressive. We have over 200 units of affordable housing in the town of Fairfield that don't count towards a moratorium because they were built before 1990. Even the fact that they have been rehabbed and modernized, they do not count. We touched on the issue of senior housing, and there's not an incentive to be able to provide housing for the individuals who have helped build our communities because they don't count for as many points. We see with 830G, there is absolutely a favor towards predatory developers, and not all developers are. I met a man not long ago who was actually out of Bethel, and he showed me the type of properties that he builds under 830G, and they don't put somebody who has their life savings in a property where they're going to build a multi-story apartment building right next to it in a neighborhood full of same type single-family homes. That's not why somebody has purchased their home and made that investment. But the other flaw, I think, is that this does not incent at all home ownership. And we talk sometimes about building intergenerational wealth, and this does nothing to support that. So in our town in Fairfield, we have so many units that are under development and projects that are proposed. But one of them was recently built in our downtown area, and it got a lot of people's attention. There's another huge one that is in our planning and zoning. But this one in particular, usually it's a building, controversy because it's in somebody's neighborhood, and that neighborhood is trying to struggle to come up with maybe funds to be able to fight this, but the rest of the town is busy, it's not in your neighborhood, not really paying attention. But when this happens smack in the middle of downtown Fairfield, and I personally believe that there is values to our community from an economic development perspective to have that historic colonial charm that we have. I grew up in Illinois. When I came to the East Coast, I was like, holy cow, we have a real treasure here. But anyway, right smack in the middle of our downtown is now a black and gray cinder block tall building that is an apartment building that got everybody's attention because, quite frankly, the developer didn't even have the respect of the community that they were building in to try to make it even fit in, to make it look, appropriate, like it would meld and not just sort of stick out. And now they're just starting to rent. So the market rate units for a 3-bedroom are over $7,000. 2 bedrooms are over $6,000, and a 1-bedroom, I believe, is $3,400. So the way that and I think, Francis, you touched on this, for a project that has 30% affordable housing and the rest is market rate, the towns can never catch up. Because they keep in this endless cycle of trying to have to beat this. So it's not that, so let's use the town of Fairfield again. We have an overlay zone in a transit-oriented development area around our metro train station. We have a housing trust fund like New Canaan. We have just partnered, the town owns some land and is partnering with Habitat for Humanity, which will build a few, like doing everything right, but there's no credit, as one of you stated, for even trying. So I do believe I might be on your repeal side, but we do need to make, I think, some significant changes. And it isn't just a Fairfield County issue. It is absolutely, as you talked about in Scotland, in eastern Connecticut, it's in New Milford, it is, suburbs of Hartford. And it's not that people don't want affordable housing, it's the leverage that is given to developers to go in and do whatever basically they want without regard to what is around or what is suitable within the confines of what that community is about. One of the real treasures, I think, of our state is that we have 169 unique and different communities, and that's a real value. So there are, I think, changes that we can make. We've talked about a lot of them, but I think that's about it.
All right, so I've got a few questions from the crowd. Please, if you have more, hold them up and we'll pick them up. For Bob Stefanowski, would you support and campaign on amending 830G, I think you kind of answered this, to provide that each of Connecticut's 169 cities and towns have the referendum to opt in or opt out of 830G so that the people can decide how they want to govern housing in their own community? And if so, what were some of the changes? That's kind of
Yeah,
line.
we talked about a lot of it, but the straight answer is yes. But we have to have another plan. It can't be let's get rid of 830G and then forget about affordable housing. I think it needs to be done in conjunction with the first selectman, the mayors, and I think it needs to, again, I'll go back, I think it needs to be the carrot, not the stick. I just think it's a bad situation. Get to 10%, otherwise this is going to happen. And that's the wrong way that we should be working together between state government and municipal government. Whether we repeal it or not, I'll work with Laura, she's the legislative expert, but it needs to be fundamentally changed. It's going to be a focus of ours from day one, and for the residents of this community, that we're going to get something done. Because what's happening right now in communities like this and across the state is not fair to homeowners. We're going to find a solution that protects people's value.
Thank you. And follow-up question, somebody wrote, what efforts have been made to amend 830G over the last 30 years? We kind of talked about that, but I do want to make sure I read the questions as asked and make sure they're fully answered. I know Tony Boucher could answer this for hours, as could Ryan Fazio. Ryan's chomping at the bit, I can tell, to answer this because he put in a number of bills on this exact issue. But maybe, I know you kind of went into this, I'd asked it earlier, but what are efforts have been made to amend 830G over the last 30 years in 2 minutes or less? Start with Francis.
Thank you. Well, every year there are bills in housing before planning and development, that committee, General Assembly, and also for the Housing Committee. Probably the most recent amendment of note occurred in 2017, where an additional, I think it was half point, was given to senior housing because there was a recognition that seniors are people too and to be treated like everybody else. And often they are on fixed incomes, so they do face special financial challenges. That bill was bipartisan. In fact, it was vetoed by then Governor Malloy, but the legislature overrode his veto. So that was a really wonderful example of progress. Unfortunately, the bill sunset after 5 years. That was written into the language. So I guess seniors aren't people anymore, they're half a person. And it would have been nice to have seen that continue because that does help keep our communities diverse, keeping everybody or all ages. Aside from that, there really hasn't been that much change in the last couple of years. I think we have largely, I think the attention has shifted yes, there are 830G fights locally, and there's a lot of public focus on it. But the focus of legislators and perhaps advocates and lobbyists has been on other proposals, such as the housing bill we saw passed a couple of years ago that was initially spearheaded by Desegregate CT. Also, the Open Communities Alliance has advanced a competing incompatible plan called Fair Share. I think that's where most of the attention has gone.
I'll just throw in one quick observation. I testified on one of the bills for the 830G, to reopen 830G, just to look at it to see whether or not we should revisit it. And there was perhaps 60 of us who testified, and luckily it was done by Zoom, and so I had a bunch of stuff in the background as I was waiting my turn to be 55 or something. And out of the 60 people, there was maybe 6 of us who thought that 830G ought to be revisited. And the level of vitriol and just absolute, I'm not even sure what the word is, but the energy on the other side that said that 830G should not be revisited unless it's meant to make it significantly more, almost punitive would be the term I'd put it. It was a lot of energy out there that says that this should not be touched. So I appreciate the efforts in trying to go at this, and it will not be an easy lift.
What can communities and individuals do to try and push back on overbuilding when 830G wields so much power over P&Zs? I have said this, and I know I'm only supposed to be the moderator, but that's kind of a loaded question, and it's basically a 4-point process that kind of goes along the same tracks, and as all legislators know this, and attorneys, so I can do some land use work, but obviously administratively, you go through the process, P&Z, you go through our Board of Finance in charge of the sewer system. So that's an administrative process. On the same track is the legal process. And that's why a number of our local elected officials cannot really comment on any pending application. So those of you that are here to hear exactly what's going on with the current development, we're going to give some comments, but perhaps around the issue, but nothing direct. So the first process is administratively within the local towns and boards and commissions. Second is the legal process that goes through the superior courts. And as I think Francis pointed out, the superior court judges just read the law as written, and there's not a whole lot of ambiguity in 830G. And where there is, we obviously fight around those issues. So that's kind of the second process, legal, going on. Superior court judges don't really have too much sympathy for towns like Canaan. Although I will say we are a model, and the governor's office has admitted to me, as the housing chair, that they appreciate all the efforts that Canaan has done. So the third process is obviously amending 830G, which is the long game, right? We've heard a number of things that have been done. I've got a list of 2-3 pages of amendments that we've put forth over the last just 7 years, frankly, and a lot of amendments Tony Boucher did much earlier than that, and Brian's done in the last few years. So that's amending 830G. And the fourth way that you address these issues is negotiation. I know you don't like to hear that, and as someone who's attacked from the right and the left, one of the things that I think I'm pretty good at is negotiating, and we're in the minority party, so we negotiate. We don't have the power to change much, just from a pure number standpoint. But look, the developers, I'm actually glad the current developer is who he is, because he has lived in New Canaan. A lot of the predatory building that has gone on in Darien in particular, as Jamie Stevenson knows, who was the first selectman of Darien, outstanding one, by the way. There was a lot of predatory building going on in Darien that was very difficult to deal with. As much as we may be disappointed in the proposed developments, and we certainly all are, I do think there is room for negotiation. I do think that the developer in question at least used to live here, and I do think he wants what's better for the Canaan. But we have to have a plan, and I know we do have a plan. We can get into that offline to whoever wants to reach out to me and have some coffee. I was told that I'm all talk and no business when it comes to my coffees, but I do try. But this is all about us answering questions as best we can, and so that's generally the 4-prong approach that goes into all 830G applications. So just going on to the next question. I shouldn't be talking as much as I am. I apologize. 830G has not worked to increase affordable housing, and we are in agreement that affordable housing is important for Connecticut's economic future. What is your plan for increasing the stockpile of affordable housing across the state? Obviously, the carrot approach and not the stick approach. Anything else you want to comment to that? Anybody?
So I mentioned the town of Scotland before, which is not 10% because there's been no interest in developing. So even if you don't have a developer, you can't build affordable housing. I think part of the problem behind 830G is the premise that zoning is the be-all and end-all, and zoning can and does affect prices, but it's limited. So the towns of Bethlehem and Eastford, neither of them have zoning. So if New Canaan were to abolish its zoning, it might end up like Bethlehem and Eastford. They're still not at 10%, right? Zoning is not the problem here. What's interesting about 830G is that it only relieves developers of having to comply with local regulations. The state did not decide to relieve developers of complying with state regulations. So a developer still has to follow the building code, everything else. So I think there's a lot of other things we could look at. What's the question, by the way?
Oh, the question or what the fact that.
Oh, yes, there are two other things we could do. So a couple of years ago, I believe 2017 again, the General Assembly passed a bill. They created 8-30J, which requires every municipality in the state to create an affordable housing plan. And those all, well, for the most part, have gone in this last summer. Many of the communities in the region worked with WestCog. We released a regional housing toolkit, which is on our website, and lists a variety of different approaches. This is the first time municipalities have been required, some of them voluntarily, but actually to have a game plan for how we're going to get closer to 10%. Now, the big challenge here is that real estate development is not easy. Every single town is a slightly different market with different costs, different availability of infrastructure, parcels, different zoning, etc. And so if you are looking at your local elected officials, whether it's your selectmen or your planning and zoning commission, they don't have all the information developers have about what it takes to make something pencil out. And nobody has ever evaluated what is the best way to get to 10%. Now, at the beginning of my history of 8-30J, I mentioned there are various other ways to get there, such as housing authority complexes, Section 8 vouchers, subsidized mortgages through USDA and CHAFA, and rehab loans. These have largely not been used by municipalities. At WestCog, we believe there is significant potential to get closer to the 10%, in fact, perhaps exceed it for some communities. But it's not been tried. So we are launching this or next month a regional affordable housing strategy, which will work with communities in the region to figure out how much will it cost, how can we maximize the construction of quality affordable housing that integrates into a community using all these other options. I don't have the answer for you now, but hopefully next year I will.
Now you know I love having Francis here. You said there was two more. One thing I do want to point out is that New Canaan does have a plan. Right now there is a moratorium application. Scott, you said how many pages? Like 180 something?
Right, 177.
And through bipartisanship, we've been reaching out to the governor's office about having that moratorium accepted, and we believe it will be. But I do want to actually have, I know Tony and Ryan have put forth specific bills for affordable housing and revisions to 830G. I don't know if you want to come up and say a word, Ryan and Tony, just a minute or less or so.
That's asking a lot of me. So much that was set up here, I couldn't agree with more. First of all, it's difficult to afford housing if you don't have a job or you haven't had a raise in many years. And Connecticut's failed on ensuring economic growth and economic opportunity. We're one of two states in the country which over the last 4 years has seen negative personal income growth in real terms, negative job growth, and negative economic growth. So you can't have affordability if you don't have economic growth. And a lot of this distracts from that discussion. You can't be taxing families into oblivion. You can't be regulating small businesses out of existence in Connecticut. But beyond that, my proposal, my legislation that I submitted this year is very similar to some of the others that have been discussed. And it's to fully reflect what is affordable housing, to give towns credit for that which is affordable, so that discrete, naturally occurring affordable housing needs to be given credit. You know, Penny's apartment, for instance, which may or may not exist. And ensuring more local input. So with the 830G, the set-aside developments, giving towns optionality for whether it's based on area or state median income. And then counting all the pre-1989 affordable public housing as well. I think Francis is really a great wealth of knowledge and so much intellectual capital is on this stage here. So, whether it's a repeal and replace or an amendment, significant change needs to happen, and there's a lot of good ideas on the table. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Well, I've been around so long that in 1997, when I first represented Canaan in the House, the first committee they gave me was the Housing Committee. Why? Because very few people wanted to serve on the Housing Committee because this issue had been raging for years before. And it was very difficult, and there was very little interest on the part of the majority party controlling that committee and this issue throughout the time that I've been there, both in the House and later in the Senate, to make any changes at all. And many of the things that Brian has mentioned, been there, done those. Every single really suggestion, accessory apartments, grandfathering, taking the grandfathering out, being more open to senior housing that's already in the district, making tweaks. In fact, this is a glaring example of just how entrenched the interest is to keep this bill and even expand it, I hear now even, so that the state has, as of right, the ability to tell you what to do locally, is that there was one year where Larry Miller, state representative from Trumbull became the poster child of 8-30G. They had so many housing projects, their schools, their roads, the congestion was legendary. And he was so frustrated, he put 32 amendments on every housing bill that one year. And I was there cheering him on. And the chair of the committee from Hartford said, we don't care how many amendments you put on there. We will literally kill all of our bills just to keep it in place. He was so frustrated, so frustrated. Even little moves, this is before the moratorium. So my party remarks is this. Connecticut has been the attraction and the envy of the country for 3 reasons, 3 pillars. Best top education, breathtaking landscapes in colonial villages and communities, and low cost, no state income tax. Well, we certainly don't have the low affordability quality of life here, but we do still have top education in our colonial villages. And this is why this issue is so important. I've talked to thousands of people in the last few months, again, and those that have moved here from New York, principally, that's who's moving in now, they are of all different political backgrounds, and uniformly they said, we left because we didn't want a 7-story complex next to my home. We love it here, and they're trying to do this, so please pay attention to what the communities are thinking right now.
Still got a minute or two. I've got a couple questions here. Why buy a home in Connecticut when zoning does not work? My only comment to that is I'm from Chatsworth, Pennsylvania, and if you want to see zoning that doesn't work, it was a rural community and now it's been overbuilt with strip malls and it's disgusting. We at least have local control most of the time except for 830G, and you just heard from some experts on what should be changed for that. A comment more than a question. As a minority, I thank you for having the courage to speak out, Bob, in the manner that you have about 830G. 830G largely abandons poor communities as lost causes rather than craft solutions to make them vibrant. Will you make this your priority in office during year 1? It's a yes.
Thank you for that.
And what does Bob think about increasing investment tax rates for property owners to build or revise dwelling units?
Absolutely. I'm all for that. I think the other issue we face is property taxes, just in general, are too high. we've got to make it more affordable, and I think to the extent we can help, I don't want to sound corny, but people like my dad that put $25,000 down, and his house is probably worth $250,000, he's 92 years old right now. We can't get him out of that house. My mom died about 10 years ago, and we wanted to get him into assisted living, and he saved up his money, and he pays the mortgage, he pays the property taxes. That's the model we should have in Connecticut, where people can use this to build equity and build wealth and build independence. And that's what we're going to do. We're up there.